2:22 a.m., Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, the Western Pacific. The island is asleep at this hour, or as close to sleep as a major U.S. military installation ever gets. The flight line is lit by amber security lighting. The B-52H Stratofortresses on the alert ramp sit silent and massive, their 8 engines cold, their weapons, bays loaded. The F-15E Strike Eagles in their hardened shelters are crewed and fueled and ready on 4-hour recall. The Patriot batteries on the island's northern and southern tips are manned around the clock by soldiers who have not missed a single radar sweep in 6 consecutive months. The Pacific Ocean spreads away from Guam's coastline in every direction for thousands of miles, black and vast and absolute, 2,900 miles to the northwest. On the Shandong Peninsula and in the karst hills of Yunnan Province, and on the dispersed mobile launcher routes of 3 PLA Rocket Force brigades, 118 ballistic and cruise missiles were in the final minutes of their launch countdown sequences. China had been planning this moment for 4 years. The strategic logic was clinical in its construction. Guam is not simply a U.S. territory in the Western Pacific. It is the operational hub of American military power in the Indo-Pacific. The fixed, forward-deployed base from which B-52s can reach the South China Sea in 5 hours, from which F-15Es can generate sorties against targets on the Chinese mainland, from which the logistics infrastructure that sustains a Pacific war effort flows in both directions. Destroy Andersen Air Force Base and the adjacent naval base Guam, and you remove the cornerstone of American power projection in the Western Pacific. You do not win the war in a single strike, but you change the geometry of everything that follows. The PLA Rocket Force had spent 4 years building the operational plan that its planners called Operation Guam Strike. 118 weapons in 5 coordinated waves, each wave designed to defeat a specific layer of Guam's missile defense architecture before the next wave arrived. The first wave, 24 DF-26B anti-ship and land attack ballistic missiles targeting Andersen's runway system and the Patriot battery sites. The opening blow designed to crater the runways and suppress the air defense before subsequent waves arrived. The second wave, 31 DF-21C medium-range ballistic missiles targeting the fuel storage complex, the munitions depot, the aircraft-hardened shelters, and the command and communications infrastructure. The third wave, 22 CJ-10 land attack cruise missiles approaching from the northwest at low altitude, targeting the Naval Station Guam port facilities and the submarine maintenance infrastructure. The fourth wave, 18 YJ-100C supersonic cruise missiles arriving from the southwest, targeting any surviving aircraft on the flight line and the radar installations. The fifth and final wave, 23 additional DF-26B missiles held in reserve to be fired on updated battle damage assessment data, finishing what the first 4 waves had started. In Beijing, the Politburo Standing Committee had deliberated for 11 days before approving the operation. The approval was conditional on a single military judgment that the strike would succeed in rendering Andersen Air Force Base non-operational for a minimum of 90 days. The PLA Rocket Force commander had given that assurance. He had presented his confidence assessment at 92%. He had made 6 catastrophic mistakes. First mistake, Operation Guam Strike had been penetrated at the planning level. A signals intelligence collection operation running against PLA Rocket Force secure communications had produced fragmentary but actionable intelligence on the operational concept. 14 months before the strike, that intelligence had been refined over subsequent months through additional collection, through satellite imagery analysis of PLA Rocket Force launcher positioning, and through classified assessments from the Defense Intelligence Agency that had reconstructed the 5-wave structure of the attack with sufficient fidelity to allow specific defensive countermeasures to be developed, positioned, and integrated into Andersen's defense architecture. The commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command had been briefed on a high-confidence assessment that a PLA Rocket Force strike against Guam was being planned. Not confirmed as imminent, but sufficiently developed to justify immediate defensive action. 7 months before the strike. 7 months of preparation. Second mistake. Guam's missile defense architecture had been fundamentally transformed in those 7 months, without any external indication that would register in PLA intelligence collection. The 2 Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries that had been Guam's primary missile defense layer were supplemented in a series of classified deployments by 2 THAAD systems, one positioned on Andersen's northern perimeter and one on the island's southern plateau, and by a Navy Aegis Ashore site whose construction had been disguised as a communications infrastructure upgrade. The Aegis Ashore site, operational for 3 months before the strike, carried SM-3 Block 2A interceptors and SM-6 dual-mode rounds. When the PLA Rocket Force's targeting analysts had modeled Guam's defenses to produce their 92% confidence assessment, they had modeled 2 Patriot batteries against 118 incoming weapons. The actual defensive architecture they were attacking had 17 separate interceptor systems across 4 distinct technology layers. The confidence assessment was built on a threat model that bore no relationship to the actual defense it was attacking. Third mistake. The DF-26B's launch signatures were detected within seconds of ignition. The space-based infrared system constellation had been specifically retasked to provide enhanced coverage of PLA Rocket Force garrison and launcher areas in the months following the DIA intelligence assessment. When the first wave's 24 DF-26B motors ignited within a 45-second window, SBIRS registered all 24 launches and transmitted the alert to Indo-Pacific Command, to Andersen's Missile Defense Operations Center, and to the White House Situation Room in under 10 seconds. The time from first launch to Andersen's missile defense systems receiving the alert, 9 seconds. The time from alert to first THAAD interceptor launch, 22 seconds. The PLA had calculated on a 3-minute warning timeline for U.S. defensive systems. The actual timeline was 31 seconds. Fourth mistake. The cruise missile approach corridors had been covered by a defensive layer that PLA operational planners had not accounted for in their targeting model. The CJ-10 and YJ-100C cruise missiles depended on approaching Guam from vectors that were outside the primary radar coverage of the Patriot and THAAD systems. Specifically, the northwest and southwest low-altitude corridors over open ocean. What the PLA targeting model had not incorporated was a pair of E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft that the Navy had been maintaining on continuous rotational patrol north and southwest of Guam since the elevated threat assessment was received. Both E-2Ds had been on station and tracking for 6 hours before the attack began. When the CJ-10S and YJ-100CS launched, the E-2DS acquired their radar returns within minutes of separation from their launch platforms and began building the intercept picture for the F-22 Raptors from the 154th Wing, Hawaii Air National Guard, that had been forward deployed to Andersen 48 hours earlier in response to the final pre-attack intelligence indicators. Fifth mistake. The munitions depot and fuel storage complex, 2 of the highest priority targets in the second wave, had been hardened to a standard that exceeded the penetration capability of the DF-21C warheads assigned to them. Following the initial intelligence assessment, the Air Force Civil Engineering Center had conducted an emergency hardening program at Andersen that increased the overhead protection of both facilities beyond the threshold at which the DF-21C's unitary warhead would achieve the structural penetration required to destroy the stored contents rather than merely damage the surface infrastructure. Additionally, the most valuable stored munitions, the precision-guided weapons that Andersen's aircraft would need in the first hours of any Pacific conflict, had been dispersed to 4 secondary storage sites around the island. none of which appeared in the PLA's targeting database. Sixth mistake. The B-52H stratofortresses on the alert ramp were not there. The most visible and symbolically important targets at Andersen, the 8 B-52Hs on the alert ramp, whose destruction would constitute the centerpiece of the operation's propaganda value, had been quietly launched on a classified training mission at 11 p.m., 3 hours before the attack. The departure had been timed to coincide with a scheduled maintenance window that routinely took several aircraft off the ramp, creating no anomaly in the pattern of life data that PLA intelligence was monitoring. All 8 B-52HS were airborne and over the Western Pacific when the first DF-26B left its launcher. They were not on the ramp when the missiles arrived. They were already armed, already fueled, and already heading toward their strike coordinates. What happened in the next 37 minutes removed 118 PLA weapons from the battle space and reduced the PLA Rocket Force's operational launch infrastructure across 3 provinces to inoperable wreckage. At 2:22 a.m., the SBIRS alert reached Andersen's Missile Defense Operations Center. The watch officer, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel from the 94th Army Air and Missile Defense Command, who had been running her crew through the exact engagement sequence she was now executing for the 3rd time that week in live drill, gave 2 words over the tactical net. 2 words that every operator at every console had been waiting for and had rehearsed 100 times. She said, "Execute. Engage." The THAAD battery on the northern perimeter fired first. 8 THAAD interceptors launched in a compressed sequence, targeting the lead elements of the first DF-26B wave at high altitude, in their mid-course phase over open ocean, before any warhead reached Guam's atmospheric envelope. The THAAD's AN/TPY-2 radar had built precise tracks on all 24 first-wave missiles within the 31 seconds between Esbjer's alert and first launch. The engagement solutions were clean, the intercept geometry optimal. 7 THAAD interceptors achieved kinetic neutralization in the upper atmosphere. 1 missed its aim point by a margin that placed it outside lethal radius. The Aegis Ashore site engaged the surviving warhead with an SM-3 Block 2A in a terminal phase intercept, achieving neutralization at 60 kilometers altitude. Wave 1. 24 missiles. 24 neutralized. 0 impacted Guam. The second wave arrived 17 minutes later. 31 DF-21C missiles on compressed trajectories designed to stress the reload and re-engage cycle of the defensive systems. The THAAD batteries had already reloaded. The Aegis Ashore site had 16 SM-3 Block 2 A cells remaining. The 2 PAC-3 MSE batteries handled the lower trajectory threats that the upper-tier systems engagement geometry could not optimally address. The second wave was the most demanding engagement of the night. 31 simultaneous tracks, overlapping arrival windows, warheads maneuvering in terminal phase. The Missile Defense Operations Center was a controlled environment of trained professionals executing a sequence they had rehearsed. 26 DF-21C warheads were neutralized in mid-course or terminal phase. 5 reached the inner engagement envelope and were taken by PAC-3 MSE in the final intercept layer. Wave 2. 31 missiles. 31 neutralized. 0 impacted Guam. The cruise missiles were handled in the air by the F-22 Raptors. 12 F-22s from the 154th Wing had been airborne since 1:47 a.m., 35 minutes before the first DF-26B launched, responding to the pre-attack intelligence indicators that the 24-hour watch at the Joint Intelligence Operations Center had assessed as an imminent launch signature. The Raptors had been positioned in defensive orbits north and southwest of Guam, their AN/APG-77 radars operating in low probability of intercept mode, their AIM-120D AMRA AMS loaded and ready. when the E-2Ds acquired the CJ-10 cruise missile tracks at 2:39 a.m. The intercept geometry was already computed and transmitted to the Raptor's mission computers. In 9 minutes of air-to-air engagement, the 12 F-22 Raptors neutralized all 22 CJ-10 cruise missiles before any reached Guam's coastline. The AMRAAM engagement was executed at ranges that demonstrated the full operational superiority of the Raptor's sensor fusion. The aircraft that PLA air defense planners had always acknowledged was beyond their ability to detect or counter in a beyond visual range engagement. The YJ-100C supersonic missiles approaching from the southwest were faster and lower than the CJ-10s. Mach 3 sea skimmers designed to be the most challenging element of the attack for point defense systems. The E-2D's tracking data fed the engagement solution directly to the Aegis Ashore site, which engaged the YJ-100C threats with SM-6 dual-mode missiles, the same round that it can engage both air-breathing and ballistic threats at extended range. 14 of 18 YJ-100Cs were neutralized by SM-6 before they crossed the 50-mile defensive perimeter. 4 continued inbound and were engaged by PAC-3 and by the Navy's CIWWS installations at Naval Station Guam. All 4 were neutralized within the final defensive layer. Wave 3, 22 neutralized. Wave 4, 18 neutralized. 0 cruise missiles impacted Guam. The 5th wave, the 23 DF-26Bs, held in reserve for battle damage assessment follow-on strikes, launched at 2:51 a.m. when the PLA Rocket Force commander received his initial damage reports and found, to his apparent confusion, that the reports contained no confirmed impacts on any target at Andersen. He ordered the reserve wave launched anyway. 23 additional DF-26Bs. The THOAD systems and Aegis Ashore engaged them with the same methodical efficiency they had applied to the first wave. 21 neutralized in mid-course, 2 in terminal phase, 0 impacted, 118 weapons, 118 neutralized. Andersen Air Force Base, undamaged. Naval Station Guam, undamaged. Every runway intact, every fuel storage facility intact, every hardened shelter intact, every Patriot and THAAD battery operational and reloading. Now, the 8 B-52H Stratofortresses that had been airborne over the Western Pacific for the previous 3 hours received their strike orders. Each B-52H carried 20 AGM-158 BJASSMER cruise missiles. The extended-range stealthy strike weapon, whose 700-mile range and low radar cross-section allowed it to be released far outside the engagement envelope of PLA air defense systems. 160 ASSMER missiles total from 8 aircraft. Their targets had been pre-assigned in the strike plan that U.S. Strategic Command had built over 14 months. The same 14 months during which the intelligence picture of Operation Guam Strike had been developing, and the defensive upgrades to Andersen had been implemented. The PLA Rocket Force launch facilities were the primary targets. The 3 brigade-level launch complexes in Shandong, Yunnan, and Jilin provinces that had generated the 118 missiles received coordinated JASSM-ER strikes beginning at 3:41 a.m. 48 JASSMs impacted the Shandong complex. 36 impacted Yunnan. 32 impacted the Jilin area, targeting mobile launcher vehicles tracked by Space Force satellites since launch. 24 additional JASSMs targeted the PLA Rocket Force command infrastructure, communications relay stations, targeting data processing centers, and over-the-horizon radar installations. The strikes were conducted in complete electromagnetic silence from the B-52H perspective. The aircraft had never activated their own radar systems, had navigated to their release points on inertial guidance supplemented by GPS, and had released their weapons at standoff ranges that kept them outside any realistic PLA air defense engagement envelope for the entire mission. The PLA's integrated air defense system in the affected regions received no targeting track on the B-52HS. They registered only the JASSMs impacts, 160 precision strikes arriving across 4 target complexes within a 40-minute window. Simultaneously, 4 F-22 Raptors from Andersen, the same aircraft that had neutralized the cruise missile waves over Guam, had been refueled and rearmed and launched on a suppression mission against PLA Air Force, forward operating bases on the Ryukyu Island chain approach that had been activated during the attack to provide potential follow-on strike support. The Raptors engaged and neutralized 2 PLA Air Force early warning aircraft that had been orbiting over international waters attempting to build a picture of the U.S. strike package. Both were neutralized by AIM-120D AMRAAM at beyond visual range, with zero engagement from the PLA aircraft, which were unable to acquire the Raptors on their radar systems. The full accounting, compiled by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command at dawn. 118 PLA Rocket Force weapons launched against Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Station Guam. 118 neutralized before impact. 0 impacts on any U.S. facility. 0 U.S. military personnel who sustained fatal outcomes. 0 aircraft rendered inoperable. All runways fully operational. All critical infrastructure intact. The 8 B-52H stratofortresses that were the strike's primary intended targets. Airborne and executing counterstrikes at the moment of impact. In retaliation, PLA Rocket Force Shandong Launch Complex, comprehensively rendered inoperable. PLA Rocket Force Yunnan Complex, rendered inoperable. PLA Rocket Force Jilin Mobile Launcher Concentration, 14 launcher vehicles rendered inoperable on their dispersal routes. Support infrastructure eliminated. PLA Rocket Force Operational Command Infrastructure, 4 communications relay stations rendered inoperable. 2 targeting data processing centers incapacitated. 3 over-the-horizon radar installations rendered inoperable. 2 PLA Air Force early warning aircraft removed from the battle space. PLA Rocket Force personnel who sustained fatal outcomes across all strike packages. 231 U.S. personnel who sustained fatal outcomes. 0. In Beijing, the Politburo Standing Committee reconvened at first light. The PLA Rocket Force commander's 92% confidence assessment had produced 0 confirmed impacts on any target at Andersen Air Force Base. The B-52HS that were supposed to be burning on the alert ramp were returning to Andersen from the west, their weapons bays empty, their missions complete, their crews preparing for the debrief that would document one of the most one-sided exchanges of strategic strike power in the history of aerial warfare. The 3 launch complexes that had generated the attack were inoperable. The command infrastructure that had coordinated it was inoperable. And Andersen Air Force Base, the target that the PLA had designated as the cornerstone to be removed, was scheduling its morning flight operations with no interruptions. At 6 a.m., the base operations officer at Andersen submitted the day's flight schedule to the CAOC at Al Udeid. It was a normal schedule. Full operations. No runway restrictions. No airspace limitations. No damage assessment requirements. Just a Pacific Air Base doing what Pacific Air Bases do. On a morning that had begun with 118 missiles in the air and was ending with none of them having reached the ground. The B-52HS trapped at 6:14 a.m. Their crews descended from the aircraft into the warm Guam morning and were transported to the debrief facility. The ramp crew refueled the aircraft, inspected them, and began the reload sequence that would have them back at alert status within hours. The cycle that never stops, sustained by people who were here before the attack and who will be here long after it. This is what happens when you strike the cornerstone of American power in the Western Pacific. You do not find a base that is unaware of your plans. You find a base that has been reading your operational planning for 14 months, that has installed 2 THAAD systems and an Aegis Ashore site under your intelligence collection's awareness threshold, that launched its most valuable aircraft before your first missile ignited, and that had its F-22s airborne before your cruise missiles separated from their launchers. You find that 118 weapons achieve 0 impacts because the defensive architecture you modeled no longer exists. It was transformed, reinforced, and optimized against your specific attack while you were finalizing the targeting solutions. You find that the B-52HS you came to destroy are overhead your launch complexes with 160 JASSMs missiles before your battle damage assessment team has confirmed a single impact. Andersen Air Force Base is operational. It was operational during the attack. It is operational now, and the PLA Rocket Force brigades that launched 118 missiles at it before dawn will require years to reconstitute the capability those missiles represented. The Pacific belongs to free nations. It always has. And on this night, at 2:22 a.m., under a star-filled sky over the most strategically critical island in the Western Pacific, the United States military proved that this will not change. 118 weapons, 0 hits, 37 minutes of engagement. And by dawn, the people who launched those weapons were assessing the ruins of the infrastructure that sent them. Andersen flies on, as it always will.